Under the silent dome of the Chilean night, where the desert breathes a dry whisper and the stars hang like frozen tears, a man sat alone before the cosmos. His name was Leslie Peltier. Not a world-famous scientist, not a member of any grand institution, but a quiet observer of the infinite. For years he had pointed his telescope toward the same patch of sky, chasing the endless motion of light and dust. But tonight, something in that familiar darkness was watching him back. The first hint came as a flicker, faint, green, almost playful. Peltier adjusted the telescope, expecting a reflection, a stray signal from an airplane, maybe a glitch in his tracking system. But it stayed. A luminous emerald point cutting through the void, steady and deliberate, tracing a path that didn't belong to any star chart he'd ever seen. He leaned forward, fingers trembling slightly over the focus controls. The image sharpened. What he saw made his breath catch. A glowing nucleus with a faint tail, a traveler drifting between the stars. Its color was unnatural, a deep electric green that seemed alive. Astronomers had already named it Tria Atlas, an interstellar visitor from beyond our solar system. For weeks, Peltier had followed its motion, logging data, comparing charts, feeding coordinates into the tracking network. It was supposed to be a comet, but that word no longer fit. At 2:03 a.m., everything changed. Without warning, 9 distinct points of light appeared around Tria Atlas. They didn't flare or fade like debris. They didn't tumble or drift, they simply were. Cold, precise, perfect. Each positioned as if following a geometric design too exact to be chance. Peltier's heart raced. The hairs on his arms stood up. Through the eyepiece, he could see them glowing softly. A pale, bluish-white shimmer, orbiting the green core like sentinels. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, recalibrated. Still there. The telescope sensors registered each object individually, each with its own pulse, its own rhythm of light. It was impossible. 9 companions moving in flawless formation around a comet that should have been nothing more than ice and rock. He captured images, one after another, trying to convince himself that his equipment wasn't lying. But every frame said the same thing. 9 luminous bodies, arranged with mathematical precision. And then came the impossible number, the energy readings. According to his instruments, each of those faint glimmers radiated power 20 times greater than the output of Earth's most advanced nuclear reactors. The data made no sense. A comet fragment could never emit that much. Even a fusion event couldn't sustain it. The laws of physics folded under the weight of the readings. He double-checked every calibration, every wire, every line of code. Nothing was wrong. It was the universe that was wrong. By dawn, he uploaded his findings to several online astronomy forums. Within hours, disbelief turned to chaos. Professionals from observatories around the world logged in, demanding the raw data. Some dismissed it as digital interference, a camera malfunction, or cosmic rays. But by nightfall, the evidence spread like wildfire. And when the confirmations started pouring in, there was no going back. The James Webb Space Telescope confirmed the anomaly. Then the Very Large Telescope in Chile, then Keck Observatory in Hawaii. 9 luminous points encircling Tria Atlas, moving in perfect unison. All instruments, all regions, same results. Probability of error, 0. The headlines never came. There were no breaking news stories, no press conferences. Within 48 hours, the silence began. The kind of silence that only governments can create. NASA stopped issuing data updates. The European Space Agency pulled public telescope feeds offline for maintenance. The astrophysics forums where Peltier had first posted his discovery vanished overnight. Accounts deleted, threads erased. But in private, among scientists who couldn't ignore the data, whispers spread. Something unprecedented was unfolding in the heavens. And then, as if the universe wished to turn the knife, another object appeared. From the opposite edge of the solar system, a colossal body began to emerge. Brighter, larger, unmistakably on a collision course with destiny. The observatories called it C/2025R21, codename SWAN. Its coma extended for millions of kilometers, so bright that even the naked eye could see it slicing across the night sky. The sheer scale of it dwarfed Atlas completely, and yet its trajectory pointed toward the same region, as if drawn by the same invisible hand. That was when the true panic began. Governments convened emergency meetings behind closed doors. Defense satellites were reactivated. The old European Don Quixote asteroid mission was quietly revived, retooled for interception. In China, engineers working on the Long March 9 were ordered to modify its payload for high-velocity pursuit. Even SpaceX and Blue Origin were contacted under strict confidentiality, their launch platforms requisitioned for rapid orbital deployment. Officially, nothing was happening. Unofficially, humanity was bracing for first contact. At Harvard, Avi Loeb, the relentless pioneer of cosmic audacity, proposed the most dangerous idea of all. He suggested that Tria Atlas wasn't a comet, it was a vessel, a mothership. The 9 luminous bodies, probes, autonomous craft deployed upon entry into the inner solar system, each moving in sync with the mother structure. It was a hypothesis so radical that it fractured the scientific community overnight. But Loeb had evidence, their synchronized appearance, the instantaneous materialization, the stable energy signatures, and the lack of debris, all indications of engineering, not chaos. For every believer, there was a skeptic. Michio Kaku, ever the voice of reason, offered a counter-theory, a catastrophic interstellar collision. In his model, Tria Atlas could have struck a dense cluster of debris traveling at relativistic speeds, releasing unimaginable energy that fragmented the comet into symmetrical pieces. These fragments, superheated and magnetically charged, might glow for weeks, producing the illusion of organized motion. In nature, Kaku argued, symmetry sometimes emerges from chaos. But the data didn't agree. Natural fragments drift apart. They lose formation. Their brightness fades as their temperature stabilizes. The 9 companions of Tria Atlas did none of that. They maintained perfect spacing, perfect trajectory, perfect luminosity. Their alignment was not organic, it was obedient. If this was a collision, Loeb quipped during a rare televised interview, then it was the most disciplined collision in the history of the cosmos. Weeks passed, and as telescopes around the globe continued to monitor both Atlas and Swan, new patterns emerged. The 2 interstellar visitors were approaching a synchronized resonance, their orbital paths narrowing toward a single intersection point near the Sun. It was no longer a question of if they would interact, but when. And buried deep in ancient archives, a disturbing connection surfaced. Across civilizations, Babylonian tablets, Chinese imperial records, medieval European chronicles, astronomers found descriptions of luminous dragons, green stars, and split comets appearing roughly every 2,200 years. Each time their arrival coincided with seismic transformations on Earth, the fall of empires, the birth of new sciences, revolutions in human thought. In China, the celestial dragon heralded the rewriting of the empire's laws. In Babylon, a twin star omen preceded the rise of new kingdoms. In medieval Europe, a green visitor in the sky appeared just before the Renaissance ignited. Coincidence or cosmic rhythm? Modern simulations traced Swan's orbit backward and confirmed what the myths had hinted. Every 2,200 years, the same object returned. The probability of a random recurrence was effectively zero. It wasn't a comet. It was a clock. Stonehenge, Mayan temples, Egyptian pyramids, all began to look different under this light. Their alignments weren't merely solar or lunar. They matched the orbital arcs of these ancient visitors, as if the builders had known, as if they were waiting, and now humanity was in the middle of that same cycle. For the first time, 2 travelers, Atlas and Swan, were converging together. 2 notes in a cosmic symphony that had been repeating for millennia, now overlapping in perfect harmony. Something was about to happen, something that could rewrite what we thought we knew about intelligence, time, and history itself. At 3:37 a.m., Universal time, on the 19th of September, the cosmos held its breath. Every major observatory across the planet was locked on target. Telescopes tracked the twin objects as they neared perihelion, their closest point to the sun. Energy readings spiked beyond all thresholds. Then, for 52 seconds, everything stopped. The universe went silent. No radio waves, no solar emissions, no background noise. Every instrument flatlined into a perfect void, a hole in reality itself. When the signals returned, Tria Atlas had moved. Its orbit had shifted, defying Newtonian mechanics. The 9 luminous bodies were no longer encircling it. They had reassembled into a pattern, a precise triangular geometry of 3 concentric rings, a structure, a message. Governments immediately classified all telemetry. The event received an internal code name, Enclave Debut. Public data streams were cut, but the world had already seen too much. Amateur astronomers like Peltier had captured partial images before the blackout. Grainy, distorted, but unmistakable. 9 glowing points revolving around a dark center, pulsing in rhythmic sequence. 3 pulses. Pause. 3 again. Pause. 2. Some called it Morse code. Others called it an invitation. Whatever it was, it marked the night when the human race stopped being the observer and became the observed. For Peltier, that realization came quietly. As dawn crept over the desert, he shut down his telescope, his hands trembling not from fear, but from awe. Somewhere beyond the sun, something had blinked back. The desert wind brushed against the metal frame of his observatory, carrying the faint scent of dust and electricity. He looked up, knowing that millions of eyes around the world, and perhaps far beyond it, were gazing at the same sky. For the first time, he felt the weight of history pressing through the stars. Something ancient, patient, intelligent, watching, waiting. The governments could silence the data, but they couldn't silence the feeling. Humanity had crossed an invisible threshold. The universe had spoken, and whether it was a whisper of welcome or a test of worthiness, no one yet knew. The silence that followed the blackout did not feel empty. It felt intentional, a wall erected between what humanity knew and what it was ready to know. In the days that followed, the world split into concentric rings of certainty and doubt. Governments entered sealed rooms. Scientists argued in encrypted channels. Ordinary people looked up every night and felt something watching the watchers. Leslie Peltier slept in fragments, jolted awake by dreams of geometry suspended over the sun. His observatory filled with the scent of hot dust and cold circuitry. He replayed those final frames again and again, 9 points revolving around a dark center, their pulses marching with a logic that begged to be read. 3. Pause. 3. Pause. 2. Then a longer silence. Not absence, but breath. He stopped trying to convince himself it could have been noise. Across the ocean, the halls of power moved with a choreography as precise as the lights themselves. In Washington, the Pentagon convened a task force comprised of astrophysicists, cryptographers, linguists, and defense analysts. In Brussels, the European Space Agency revived an old blueprint, a shelved asteroid deflection mission called Don Quixote, the bones of which were quickly adapted into something faster, leaner, more uncertain. In Beijing, engineers were ordered to reconfigure Long March 9 for rapid deep space pursuit. Launch manifests shifted quietly. Payload fairings changed shape under canvas at airless hangars. Official statements said nothing. But the skies above Boca Chica and Kourou grew busy at odd hours. At Harvard, Avi Loeb doubled down. If the reconfiguration of the 9 objects into a triple-ring triangular matrix wasn't engineering, it was a cosmic coincidence of such spectacular obedience that it might as well be. He drew equations on a whiteboard until his hands shook. Phase coupling, multibody coherence, emergent order, and still the simplest explanation was the one that kept staring back: intent. Michio Kaku appeared on television to offer context without panic. "Before we call this a message," he said gently, We should exhaust every exotic natural mechanism in the book: plasma resonance, solar electromagnetic lensing. We have to ask whether the sun itself could be acting as an amplifier, carving interference patterns into space. He smiled in that familiar way, empathetic, cautious, a hand on the shoulder of a frightened planet. Nature is a master of illusions. But in private, even the skeptics watched the same 3-3-2 rhythm and felt a pressure at the base of their skulls. It didn't feel like chaos. The first breakthrough didn't come from a national lab. It came from a windowless office in a university basement where a small team of graduate students decided to test the pulses against everything they could think of: prime number series, Fibonacci spacing, hydrogen line harmonics, binary compression. Nothing resolved cleanly until someone remembered a lecture on deep space navigation and the time signatures of pulsars. When they overlaid the sequence on a map of millisecond pulsars, something subtle clicked. Not a direct match, but a pattern of offsets that could form a kind of celestial compass. The 9 lights weren't just blinking, they might be pointing. They sent their preprint to a senior astronomer who had once torn apart their code in a seminar and who, this time, didn't reply for 12 hours. When he did, it was only 3 words: "Do not share." By then, the rumor had already leaked into the bloodstream of the internet. Threads bloomed in the deep corners, stitched together by night owl coders and backyard observers. Snippets of grainy frames, Fourier transforms, speculation written in the urgent grammar of a species that had never felt so small and so large at once. The leak was dismissed as a hoax, then as disinformation, then as something else, something not yet named. Peltier saw the diagrams and recognized the vertigo, the rush that comes when the distance between myth and math collapses. He went outside into the desert quiet and let the sky press down on him. You would have felt the same if you were there, that odd tilting sensation that the ground had become a raft and the night was a river moving beneath it. 2 weeks after the blackout, the United Nations convened an emergency session behind heavy doors, while cameras waited downstairs for nothing at all. The proposal came from a familiar voice: establish a planetary preparedness council, an apolitical transnational body with the authority to coordinate observation, communication, and, if necessary, response. Not a war council, the speaker insisted, his eyes raw with sleeplessness. A dignity council. We cannot meet the cosmos with fear. It should have been a ceremonial gesture destined to dissolve in bureaucracy. It wasn't. The resolution passed, narrowly but clearly, and that night, for the first time since the silence began, an official statement reached the public. There is no indication of hostility. There is indication of structure. We will proceed with caution and with unity. Unity proved to be the hardest word. Religious leaders took to pulpits and live streams with voices that wove comfort into thunder. Some saw portents and promises, others saw tests. Conspiracy entrepreneurs sold maps and metal charms shaped like triangles. Markets fluttered. A small island nation announced a 3-night festival of lights and pointed every lantern toward the sea. In classrooms, children drew 9 little circles around a green dot and gave them names. And yet in labs and control rooms, something stalwart held, the stubborn rhythm of method: observe, doubt, confirm question, hypothesize, repeat. The radio telescopes moved as if choreographed by a single hand, fast in Guizhou, Alma over the Chilean plain, Mir Kat on the Karoo, Goldstone. Arecibo's absence felt like a missing tooth. They listened at the hydrogen line, then at frequencies humans used for our noisiest chatter, then at the quiet spaces in between. Nothing intelligible, nothing like a voice. But the pulses continued. 332, with a drift so slight it might have been heartbeat rather than intention. When the sun spat a minor coronal mass ejection, the sequence wavered for 6 minutes, then restabilized. That too felt like meaning. Swan grew brighter until it carved a white road across the night. People who had never cared about the sky before stood on balconies and watched it tear the dark very gently. Photographers drove until the pavement ran out, then walked with tripods over salt flats that mirrored the stars. There is a way that human beings look upward when they are trying to remember something old. That look was everywhere. Tria Atlas, in contrast, became harder to see, not because it dimmed, but because the 9 companions had drawn into a geometry that refused simple capture. Image processors began to push the limits of their software, deconvolution, noise modeling, blind deblurring, and for a few blessed frames the structure stood out crisp as an etched seal. 3 rings, a perfect triangle inscribed, a hollow at the center. Every pattern invites projection. Crop circles, cathedral rosettes, semiconductor masks, sacred geometry. The human mind is an engine that spins symbol from arrangement. But what nagged at the most sober analysts was not the beauty, it was the durability. Natural systems itch. They drift, they smear. This did not. It held. Inside a conference room, thick with stale coffee and fear, a young cryptographer drew a spear of chalk through the triangle's center and divided the rings into equal arcs. "If it's a compass," she murmured, "it might be a gate." The room went very quiet. A senior physicist frowned. Gates were for stories. But later alone, he ran simulations of gravitational lensing near perihelion and found that under certain conditions the configuration could bend light not just around the sun but through it, a corridor carved in curvature. He saved the file as hypothesis, corridor. The first provisional mission rolled to a pad in the pre-dawn hush. The rocket's skin was a concise encyclopedia of human labor. Valves polished by hands that would never see the sky. Composite filaments wound by machines named after constellations. Software written in midnight by the same people who had spent childhoods printing out star charts from dot matrix printers. The payload was small. A smart probe with a sunshade, a coronographic eye, a nervous system of sensors tuned to be brave and breakable. It rose without fanfare, no broadcast, no countdown for public hearts to hold. It cleaved the morning and vanished. 3 more followed from 3 other continents within a week. A braided cord of effort, flung towards something that might have been a mirage or a door. Meanwhile, the archives gave up further secrets. A scholar of ancient Chinese astronomy found a notation in a Han Dynasty chronicle describing a dragon star that split into 9 lights for not yet the measure of one breath, before recombining and pointing to the heart of the sky. A Babylonian tablet, poorly translated a century ago, was reread. The guest star stood with 9 servants and made the heavens still. In a monastery library in northern Italy, a monk's marginal doodle showed 9 dots in a little triangle, and beneath them a single word, silentium. No one could prove those scratches weren't paranoia projected backward, but they were enough to convince even the cautious that if this was a cycle, we were not the first to stand beneath it and feel our mouths go dry. Peltier received an email with no salutation and a file attached. The sender's address was a string of nonsense. The file was a compressed archive of logs and frames he had never seen, transmissions from instruments he would never touch. He opened them expecting to feel small, and did. But in the quiet that followed, he also felt something like a hand on his back steadying him. He folded the data into his own, a private braid of numbers and faith, and built a timeline so meticulous it could have doubled as a prayer. At 3:37:02, the energy spike. At 3:37:04, the first dip. At 3:37:18, the onset of radio silence. At 3:38:10, the return, and the first clean frame of the triangular matrix. He stared at that timestamp until it lost its meaning as a time and became only an instant. Once, he had wanted to discover something no one had discovered. Now he wanted only to honor what the sky revealed to anybody paying attention. Scientists are not a monolith. Some went home to their families and told nobody anything and slept, hard and bleak. Some stayed and argued until the sun came up and the coffee went cold. A few cried for reasons they could not articulate that had nothing to do with fear. To be alive at the hinge of a story is to feel both crushed and chosen. The Planetary Preparedness Council held its first open session. It lasted 17 minutes and revealed very little. But when it ended, An addendum appeared on the council website that nobody expected, and nobody could later explain the provenance of: a request for proposals for a dignified signal. Not a beacon, not a broadcast of coordinates and equations, not the predictable hydrogen spin frequency speech every SETI romantic keeps tucked in a drawer of dreams. The phrasing was peculiar and precise. We seek a signal that says, we are many and we can be one. We are flawed and we are learning. We are small and we are not afraid to be seen. We seek a signal that carries humility and courage in equal measure. The invitation detonated across art schools and physics departments and neighborhood makerspaces. Choir directors made calls. A composer in Reykjavik wrote a draft score composed entirely of ratios found in coral growth. A painter in Lagos proposed a fleet of reflective sails shaped like shells, unfurling beyond the moon. A linguist in Oaxaca suggested a braided tapestry of indigenous counting systems translated into pulse intervals. A deaf collective in Seoul designed a signal that would encode motion rather than sound, a language for eyes and machines. For once, nobody asked who would get the credit. The planet had tilted toward plural. Swan reached a brightness that made even city skies feel honest again. The chalk-white plume arced over rooftops and reservoirs and highways where drivers pulled over, stepped out, and forgot why they had been late or angry or alone. The world paused mid-sentence and looked up together, and that more than any council resolution was the first real sign that unity was not beyond us. The probes reached their stations around the sun and began to whisper home. Their coronagraphs pulled the glare aside like curtains. The field beyond blazed with the brutal simplicity of starlight. In that flood of photons, the 9 companions of Tria Atlas looked less like ornaments and more like instruments. Thin flares against the solar wind, surfaces changing texture in rhythms that lined up with the pulses. They were doing something to light, not reflecting, rewriting. A technician watching the feed in a dark room let out a small, involuntary laugh. That short, startled sound we make when a magician we don't believe in does something we can't explain. Back on Earth, 100 proposals for a dignified signal were synthesized into one. Not the best, because best no longer made sense, but the most us. The plan was simple, breathtakingly so. At an agreed moment, a network of ground-based lasers and low-orbit reflectors would sweep a slow spiral onto the daylight side of the moon, a ghost luminous fingerprint no eye could see but any instrument could feel. The spiral's periods encoded a series of humble declarations. We are from water and dust. We count by tens because of our hands. We break what we love and try to mend it. We know the value of a promise. The council scheduled the spiral for a date nobody published. Conspiracies boomed. Memes multiplied. And still, quietly, engineers aligned mirrors and cued the sequence. In the countdown rooms, people held each other's glances, the way climbers pass a rope. Hours before the signal, something changed at Tria Atlas. The 9 objects drifted, not apart but inward, tightening their radii in a motion so smooth it felt like breath drawn before speech. The triple rings compressed. The triangle inscribed within rotated by a fraction of a degree, enough that whole teams of mathematicians sat up straight at once. The pulses quickened. 332 became 553, then 855. The numbers walked toward something. Someone whispered primes. Someone else whispered music. At 3:37:00 UTC, precisely 1 lunar month after the blackout, the spiral began. A soft sweep across the moon's face, unseen but not unfelt. Over deserts and oceans, over night shift warehouses and hospital wards, over kitchens where children were told to put their shoes by the door, humanity sent a prayer that did not beg, a greeting that did not kneel. The sky did not reply, not at once. The human heart is bad at waiting, especially when it has been brave. Minutes became hours. The moon turned its bright cheek and kept her counsel. People slept a little, then woke to go about the chores of living in a world that had leaned towards something unnameable, and then leaned back. In a grocery store, a cashier traced a spiral in a smear of spilled sugar and smiled without knowing why. In the second dawn after the signal, the probes near the sun recorded a change so delicate it was almost missed. a phase shift in the way the 9 objects touched the solar wind, a subtle retuning, the pulses elongated by a hair's breadth. The triangular matrix opened a notch at one vertex, a door likeness that if you were in a romantic mood, you might call a welcome rather than an aperture. On the ground, the change looked like a shimmer in data, a bent hair on a violin string. It looked like possibility. That night, Peltier walked out into the desert and set his camera to a slow exposure, aimed not at the travelers near the sun, but at the faces of the people who had come to watch. There were more of them now, loners and couples, parents teaching children words like coma and perihelion and patience. He captured the way their shadows stretched and mingled, the way strangers shared thermoses, the way a single bright streak across the sky could draft a temporary nation onto dry ground. When he looked at the frame on his screen later, he could see it clearly. Not 9 points, not a green heart, not a white road, only the reflection of a species learning how to stand together in the dark without flinching. Elsewhere, a physicist reopened the file labeled hypothesis, corridor, and added a note. If it is a passage, it is not for us to take by force. It is for us to be invited through. Elsewhere still, a child taped a spiral of foil to their bedroom window and fell asleep with their hand pressed against the glass as if waiting for the night to pulse back. The weeks that followed were strange in the purest sense of the word, as in unaccustomed to us, still somehow ours. We learned to live in the long inhale between question and answer. We grew a new muscle, restraint. Not every instrument was fired. Not every theory was shouted. The council released small, steady updates in a voice that felt like a lighthouse, present, unpanicked, visible through weather. Nobody knows how the story ends because the story is not an arrow but a tide. But certain things became true enough to stand on. The 9 companions moved as if guided by a clock outside our clocks. Swan described its wide, blazing curve and began, as all things do, to fade. Tria Atlas held its place like a thumb pressed lightly on the staff of music that is the sun's gravity. The pulses settled into a pattern we could not parse, and yet that calmed us, the way a heartbeat steadies, even when we don't know the song. Perhaps they were measuring us. Perhaps they were measuring the sun. Perhaps the distinction is smaller than we think. In a small studio where the walls were pinned with scores and star charts, the composer from Reykjavik recorded a piece called 52 Seconds. It was not sad, it was not triumphant, it was a room made of sound where you could feel the exact shape of the gap between what we knew and what wanted to be known. People listened to it on trains and in bathtubs and in the minutes before meetings began. And for 3 or 4 breaths, they felt unafraid of not knowing. In Lagos, one of the reflective sails snagged a crosswind at deployment and crumpled like a moth. The team laughed and swore and learned and sent another. Failure grew a new dignity. No world government fell. No new world government rose. But something quieter shifted, the angle of our gaze. We kept our small promises more often. We asked better questions in classrooms. We used the word we with less irony. If you were to stand now where Peltier stands and look up, you would see what he sees. Not a sign, not an omen, not a threat to be met or a crown to be claimed, but a presence whose patience outlasts our headlines. The desert would smell of iron and sage. The air would have that edge it gets when weather is far away, and yet thinking of you. The green of Tria Atlas would be faint now, the white of swan a memory written in the kind of ink that only lives in retinas. The matrix would not show itself to your naked eye. But if you stayed, if you let the night settle around you like a cloak rather than a cage, you might notice the oldest miracle of all, that the universe is not required to answer us, and yet sometimes through ice and dust and angles and intervals, it does. And if one dawn, in some near future where our instruments have learned a few more manners, the pulses were to change, to climb a ladder we finally recognize, to step across the border from pattern into language, then perhaps we will find that the first word is not a command or a riddle or a warning, Perhaps it is a greeting whose literal translation does not matter, because we will know it by the way our shoulders drop and our throats loosen and our eyes sting. Perhaps the first word will feel like its own echo. Until then, we stand at the railing of a ship we did not build, on a sea that remembers us better than we remember it, and we practice what we will say when it is our turn to speak. We decide what face we will turn toward the door that has opened a fraction at the edge of the sun. We learn how to be many and one. We collect ourselves. The world, imperfect and inconvenient and incandescent, spins. In a kindergarten, a teacher points at a poster of the solar system and says, "This is home." And for the first time, those two words feel like a promise rather than a plea. On a night shift, a nurse steps outside to breathe and catches the tail of a meteor and wishes foolishly and truly. In orbit, a small probe, no larger than a human embracing itself, threads a needle of light and sends back a line of data so elegant it makes a tired engineer laugh out loud. We wait, but the waiting is not empty. It is a workshop, it is a chapel, it is a countdown made of longer numbers. And if someday soon the 9 companions of Tria Atlas unravel their geometry and angle that open notch toward us, and if the sun itself bends in a way that says enter, and if the council asks across the planet in a voice that shakes but does not break, are we ready? Then perhaps because of these weeks, because of these small, stubborn choices, because of a man in a desert who kept his eye to the eyepiece when fear told him to look away, we will be able to answer with something honest. Not yes, not no, but this: we are here, we are listening, we are learning how to be worthy of the question.